Energy Media readers, we have got a very, very exciting story for you tonight, but I want you to stick around for a little bit longer than you normally do, because this is kind of a nerdy technical story that it deals with a huge issue for the Alberta oil and gas sector, and it is a potential solution, or one of a number of solutions, to the market access problem, otherwise known as pipeline capacity. And so to help us through an announcement that came out today about a diluent recovery unit that's been approved by the Alberta government, we're going to welcome back Richard Masson, who's an economist with the University of Calgary. So welcome to the interview, Richard.
Good to be here, Markham.
Now, you are the perfect person to interview for this, because you also wear another hat, which is you're involved in a company called Fractal that does partial upgrading and has recently entered into an agreement with Cenovus to do, I think it's 50,000 barrels a day?
We're working to build a 50,000 barrel a day plant, yeah, and Cenovus would be taking part of the capacity in that. That's right.
Excellent. So the idea here is that on average, the diluent that's added to bitumen, so it'll flow in a pipeline, it's about 30% of that fluid, and your process would upgrade the bitumen to maybe a medium or maybe a lighter heavy crude, so that you need either no diluent or much less diluent, freeing up space in the pipeline. It's like free space, free pipeline. You don't have to build more pipelines. You just free up, make better use of what you've got. The announcement today is it's a joint venture between Gibson Energy and an American company, and they have an agreement with ConocoPhillips for 50,000, and they do things a little differently, but with the same outcome, which is they take the diluent out at a recovery unit that'll be built near Hardisty. They take it out of the DRUbit, and then the rest of it goes into what's left goes into a rail car. And have I got all this straight?
You do. In essence, what's happening, so diluent, as you said, needs to be thinned, reduced viscosity so it can move down a pipeline. So right now we have a number of pipelines that move diluent up to the Fort McMurray area. They blend that diluent, which is very light, very, very light, like gasoline, in with the bitumen. It becomes something that will flow down a pipeline. So what's happening is once it gets to Hardisty, which is a major pipeline hub, these two companies, Gibson Energy and U.S. Development Corp, are planning to build a diluent recovery unit. Effectively what that will do, it's like a big kettle. It'll boil the diluted bitumen, and the light part, the diluent, boils off very easily, and the heavy part doesn't boil at all. And so you end up taking the light part off. You can capture it as vapors, recycle it, send it back up to Fort McMurray for reuse. So that saves a bunch of energy by not having to import stuff all the way from Chicago. Right now, we're importing about 300,000 barrels a day of diluent all the way from Chicago to use in Alberta on two separate pipelines. And then the bitumen, we call them neat bitumen, because there's no more diluent in it, or only a little bit. That then goes into rail cars in unit trains, so 50 to 60,000 barrel trains, about 100 cars. And we'll go down the rail system to the U.S. Gulf Coast, where there'll be a dedicated terminal to receive it, and it'll get either sent to refineries or put on ships.
That's right. I remember a couple of years ago, Gibson Energy announced that it was building 104, their unit trains would have 104 rail cars, tank cars, for doing this very thing. So they've been preparing for this for a couple of years. And now the reason, there's another benefit to this, is that once you take the diluent out of it, it essentially becomes the neat bit, or the DRUbit, as they've trademarked this product, is essentially, I'm not sure if it's non-flammable, or it won't light. If you have a crash, it's not likely to explode or light on fire. It essentially becomes just any other hazardous good.
Non-hazardous is essentially the thing. So there's the idea behind this is to try and get cost savings. So if we step back a little while, there used to be 7 years ago no crude moved by rail. But then when we didn't have enough pipelines and people needed options, we started to move more crude by rail. So the terminal that Gibson and U.S. Development Group operate at Hardisty right now does about 3 unit trains a day. So 300 or 180,000 barrels a day approximately moves by rail from that facility, and I think they're intending to grow it another unit train a day, so that'd take it to 240,000. So it's the largest facility in Alberta. And the idea is right now in each of those rail cars, about 30% of it is this light diluent. And that, although it's mixed with the bitumen, if a tank car crashes and gets heated up, that stuff starts to boil out. It has vapor pressure. That's the stuff that has the potential to be hazardous. And so the idea is if we have less diluent in the rail car, not only do we get 30% more of what we actually want to ship, which is bitumen, but we also reduce its hazard level, and so you can get better freight rates. So it's about cost reduction, about improving the safety performance, but in order to do that, you've got to build a new processing unit in Alberta, and that's what got approval by the Alberta Energy Regulator today after a regulatory application.
Now, the company Gibson Energy in its press release makes the claim that essentially this new process is the rail, DRUbit on rail is competitive with sending DRUbit by pipeline down to the Gulf Coast. You're an economist. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a whole pile of assumptions that have to go into that, but I think, the idea about saving the diluent in Alberta and you can resell it, so that reduces, there's always a loss you take on buying diluent in Alberta and selling it in the Gulf Coast where there's too much of it already. So by avoiding that discount, that's helpful. By getting 30% more bitumen into a rail car, that's helpful. And if you can transport it as non-hazardous, that's also good. So all those things are to the benefit of DRUbit going by rail. Rail is inherently more expensive per barrel. There's more labor, there's more energy required. But trying to optimize this is what this is about. So whether it's going to be competitive will depend what the cost of building this diluent recovery unit is going to be, what the cost of the unloading facility at the other end is going to be, and what kind of arrangements they're going to make with the railways, all of which is commercially confidential. So, we can only take them at their word.
Right. And I think we've summed up the major points of this project pretty well. And but to pull back to the 35,000 foot level for a moment, Richard, if you take the work that's being done with Fractal on the partial upgrading, the work here on the DRUbit, and then there's the canopucks, which are the little puck-like containers of bitumen that can go also in a rail car that CN has been doing pilot projects with. It seems to me that Alberta innovation is grappling and successfully grappling with the issue of market access.
And these things take a long time. So for example, Fractal's been working on its technology development for 13 years to get to the point that we're about ready to build our first commercial plant. And the idea is, again, to reduce the viscosity and allow us to use less diluent. So we can reduce it by 50 to 60% and still get the bitumen to flow in a pipeline. So we're a little bit different than a diluent recovery unit because we can go in a pipeline. We could also go on rail. That's one way to optimize the overall system because you get more bitumen down the export pipelines. And if you can do enough of that, eventually you don't need as much diluent import, and you can reverse those import pipelines to be export pipelines, which would add more pipeline capacity without building anything. So that together, canopucks is another idea. I mean, that's one step beyond because everybody in a refinery situation knows how to deal with things that come down a pipe. They know how to deal with things that come out of a rail car. But dealing with solid things is another whole level of change. So, all these things take time to go through the process to get refinery customers comfortable that that's something that they can use. But when it works, if canopucks work, I mean, it's easy to store solids, on the ground. Much cheaper to do it. You can inventory them easier. There's lots of benefits if that technology can get proven up. So, yeah, I think in Alberta, we've been compelled by the lack of pipeline space to get innovative and start taking matters into our own hands to try and address the issues.
Well, you know what? Not only has Alberta been sort of seized with this, anger and angst over pipelines, because of course investment and jobs and businesses are tied to that market access. So we understand that perfectly. But it seems to me that the idea of building more pipelines and going through more of what we've gone through over the last 5, 6, 7 years, as opposed to these innovations that avoid all of that, that seems to me to be a much better solution long term. And it also offers flexibility. And that's something that producers often talk about, is the flexibility to send the product to markets, that maybe the price is a little higher here, a little higher there, and they have that flexibility they don't have with a pipeline.
Yeah, that's absolutely one of the big benefits of rail is you can find niche markets that like your product and go directly to them. You're not constrained by where our existing pipelines go. Another one I would point out is by making the system more efficient, you actually reduce the greenhouse gas footprint. So I can speak to Fractals numbers because I know them best. You know, reducing diluent by 50 to 60% means 10% wells to tank reduction in the greenhouse gases for the bitumen, right? Because you're not having to move so much diluent around in the system. And so those things are partly how we're going to make the system more cost effective and more greenhouse gas beneficial.
Excellent. Richard, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. And I hope we have another chance to discuss this technology. And we need to have one of these days have an interview about Fractals so you can tell me, our readers, exactly how that technology works.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.